Coming up next is the high-level panel on how to strengthen Europe's digital sovereignty. I'd like to introduce you to the moderator of that panel, Mr. Wolfgang Ischinger, chairman of the Munich Security Conference. Mr. Ischinger, the floor is yours.
Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, wir sprechen.
Thank you very much. As I've understood, we're talking German.
Ich bin außerordentlich dankbar.
I am very grateful for having been given this task of moderating the panel.
Fragen den Problemkreis
or any questions about digital sovereignty, they are on the very top of the security agenda today, tomorrow, and in the days to come. So before I hand over or ask a few questions to the defense ministers, I'd only like to make a couple of observations. In terms of security and foreign policy, the increase in power for the individual through cyberspace is something that impacts the monopoly of the state when it comes to the use of power. That has certain consequences that we can't even grasp today. One of the consequences is that suddenly companies, just think of Facebook, Google, etc., so big companies suddenly play a geostrategic role that they did not play in the past. With this increasing role and power and influence of the private sector, should come along an increased responsibility, including the responsibility to set standards for cybersecurity and to comply with these standards. As part of the Munich Security Conference, we tried to work towards that. 3 years ago already, one of the big tech giants, Microsoft, suggested having a digital Geneva Convention to protect civilians from the effects of cyber war. 1 year later, 2 years ago, the Charter of Trust was born at the Munich Security Conference, and that's important to me because together with large companies like Siemens, Allianz, Daimler, Airbus, IBM, and others, we have established this Charter of Trust as a basis of trust into the reliability of cyber connections and the cyber world in general. I believe that trust is an important pillar of any further development of our cyber policy, of our foreign cyber policy. Without trust, norms are neither complied with nor developed further. And I believe that trust, at least in my experience in international diplomacy, trust is the currency of diplomacy. So trust is a key aspect. I am very happy to have the two ministers of defense here for conversation. I want to mention that the listeners can get involved via chat box. The last 10 minutes of the 40-minute panel will be devoted to questions from the audience. Let me begin with the following questions. I'm asking the German Minister of Defense. So the notion of digital sovereignty is a buzzword in the discussions. Besides other issues like strategic sovereignty or even strategic autonomy, can you tell the audience or explain to the audience how you see digital sovereignty? What exactly is the aim of digital sovereignty as you understand it? And then I also want to put a question to the Dutch Minister of Defense, if I may. Very openly, you said that you realized in your vision paper that the Netherlands are not sufficiently prepared or equipped for the challenges of the digital world. So we know from history that there have been situations where the cavalry went on the battlefield against German tanks with devastating results. So are we sufficiently aware, also when it comes to the public, that we are experiencing a revolution at the moment that is almost as significant as when there was the transition from the cavalry to the mechanized troops? So if I think about the use of drones in Nagorno-Karabakh, where suddenly drones are causing devastations, and it's not happening on the ground so much more. So those are big changes, and what do we need to do to address that appropriately? Mr. Ischinger, thank you very much for the interesting question. So what connects us in Europe? Of course, we are connected by many common interests, but above all, we are connected by common values. And one of the important values is certainly that of freedom, to lead a self-determined life as an individual. And we have an understanding of a state to protect this freedom for the individual. And if we come from that direction, then digital sovereignty for me means to be able, also in the future, when it comes to state action, that we can be secure and free. That means without external influence, without manipulation, but also without being blackmailed from outside, that we can act without all of this. And earlier you mentioned trust. And if you look at the current debate, for example, about how to deal with COVID-19 pandemic, then we notice that the political discussion is not necessarily about the concrete measures, but the debate is about the reality itself, and we're asking ourselves, what reality are we talking about? And that's a big difference to debates in the past. And the question of who shapes reality in a digital world, what facts are real facts and what are fake news. So this is an increasing dimension of conflict, a dimension of threat, of challenges, and it's about defending ourselves against that and to become or maintain some sovereign autonomy through that. That is the framework in which we define digital sovereignty, and from that we derive that we need to position ourselves in respect to that on our own, but also together with our European partners. Thank you very much. Before I hand over to the Dutch colleague, let me ask one more question. How concerned are you that we, the members of the European Union, are technologically dependent to a large extent from non-European providers? So what needs to happen for this dependence to be reduced? It's certainly not just the task of a defense minister, but maybe also a task of the defense minister. Maybe you can say a couple of words on that. Yes, if you think about the basis of the great industrial success, not just in Germany, but in the whole of Europe, then that was certainly the fact that we were setting standards in the world. For example, the DIN norm. We see in the digital world that this is being looked at in different ways. And those who set the benchmarks, those tend to be actors who are outside of Europe. And if we want to make sure that our voice is heard in this concert, then we need to make sure that we develop a common ability to shape these benchmarks, to influence them. And that is a central point, the understanding that no country in Europe can do this on its own, but in the international concert, we will only have a chance if we finally do it together as Europe. The first steps towards that have been taken. But I have to say clearly, these steps must be faster and must be taken more consistently than in the past. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to the Dutch Minister of Defense. I'll repeat my question. How significant are the changes that we are facing in terms of military strategy through the new innovative technologies, and to what extent are we sufficiently prepared for that or not? Minister.
Thank you very much. I would like to add something to what Annegret said first, though. I think that she is right. I think that we have to invest a lot more in European cooperation, because right now in Europe, we depend on companies outside of Europe. And not all of these providers adhere to European norms and standards, democratic values, human rights, and sometimes they even cooperate with state actors, as our intelligence services are reporting. They report on these kind of risks every day, and they report on cyber attacks. So I believe that Annegret is right. We should invest a lot in trust and in European cooperation. Regarding your question, I already said in my speech that we are very open about where we stand at the moment. And I believe this is where other countries stand as well, not just us in the Netherlands. So we are very aware of the deficiencies we have and how fast the development is progressing. You talked about cavalry and tanks, and I believe that is quite aptly put, really. So, if I think about the use of new technologies, then I think that this offers the EU member states a great opportunity to modernize their armed forces, and I believe that this is what we have to do now. This is also part of Dutch policy. I think we have to think about how technologies can help us do our work, and beyond that, the use of technologies can help us to make military missions safer and more precise. That is also key for our work, really. Increasing geopolitical threats ask and require state-of-the-art armed forces, and I believe that the use of technology offers huge opportunities here. It is important, however, again, that we cooperate within Europe, and to me this is the heart of the matter. I would like to do this work together with Annegret, together with Germany, because I believe we really have to push this issue. And this is true both for research and development and also for the development of a legal framework for the use of new systems. I did not mention that in my keynote, but I believe that this is an important matter for us at the European level or at NATO level too. So, yeah, it was important to me to add that. I believe that within the EU, we all agree that it is absolutely essential that the use of new technologies happens under human control and stays under human control. And we need to keep posing ourselves the questions that these technologies bring up. Thank you very much, Minister. But please, if I may, let me add something or ask another question maybe. If I listen to you, then I ask myself the question, did we take the right steps if we as NATO members, we as EU members spent the last 6 years discussing the 2% target with our publics too? Shouldn't we really be discussing something else? Namely, that we're not talking about more money alone, but we're talking about money for the modernization, for the digital change, digital transformation of our armed forces and our infrastructure. And that this is going to cost a lot of money, of course. I believe that the public would have an easier time understanding that than this more general and more abstract 2% target as it was formulated in 2014. Could you maybe tell me about your experience here? Yes, of course. And I believe that we are on the same page. I believe that it is always very important to not talk about money. But of course, if you make an agreement, then you stick to it. But I do think that we should not only talk about money, but it is about cash capabilities and commitments, and it should also be about capacities. In our paper, we stated that it is important to look at the specific threats of our time. If you look at these threats, then you can see a certain development, and it is a very, very fast development, and we should discuss that. And this is what we clearly state in our paper. If we take these threats seriously, then we should really change the discussion, and we will have to change the debate we're having at the moment within NATO too. What do we want to be? Where do we want to be in 2035? What is our vision? What will the rest of the world look like? And what will we look like as an organization, a defense organization? What will our position be? And we don't do that nearly enough. Thank you very much. I have another question for Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer now. I would like to get back to the question of European weakness, or maybe strength that is not quite there yet in software and technology development. So we have a certain admiration for huge non-European businesses, but we also view them with a certain concern. So my question is, are we in danger of being left behind? Do we actually have a chance by pooling and sharing? That is a term that we've been using for several years in European defense policy. So does pooling and sharing offer us a chance to strengthen the European digital and software industry in such a way that it is properly set up for modernizing the defense capabilities of our armed forces? So I would like to hear more from you about how military requirements and economic opportunities go together. And of course, the key question is, will we manage to create European cross-border solutions, shared solutions? That has been difficult in the past when it was about armament, because there were national concerns, jobs, protection of jobs, national jobs. So I would like to hear more from you on this, Minister. Of course. But I would like to add to what Ang said and your last question. We've been trying, and I have been trying, to make very clear what 2% actually means. It means that we have committed to actually offer 10% of our German capabilities to NATO. And if you translate that into money for capability buildup, then you will need around about 2% of GDP. So money always translates into capabilities. And NATO has developed over the years, always reacting to the threat situation. And if the threat situation is digital now, we have new spheres like the cyber sphere, then of course we have to build up defense capabilities here too. Regarding your question, I believe that we have to get away from this belief that in a European Union that is as diverse as it is, we could be successful in building like central institutions that are then good for all member states. I believe that, especially when it comes to digital transformation, we see excellent approaches in many different countries. And no matter their size, I believe, for example, that the Baltic states are quite a few steps ahead of us in Germany when it comes to digital technologies. But if we look at CODE and Concordia, there's this approach of really pooling all these excellent individual approaches within Europe to get to a truly European network. And I believe that this is the right way ahead. But we need more than the public sector here. We also need the private sector. We need businesses. And we should look at startups, but we should also look at the so-called unicorns. And we in Europe are not worse set up than businesses in China or in the US or elsewhere in the world. We have brilliant minds in Europe. We have excellent innovation and ideas and entrepreneurship in Europe. But quite often we can see that as soon as the so-called unicorns reach a certain size, we don't manage to support them with Euro funds so that they stay in Europe and keep growing in Europe, because we do not have an internal capital market to enable that. So we basically force our innovative young tech companies to resort to using capital from the US and from China, and this means that we lose influence on these growing companies. And I believe, therefore, that this part of European policy, this true internal market, is key, because we want businesses to grow within Europe to be able to withstand international competition. This is not a matter of ability to innovate. We absolutely have that. But it is a matter of scalability, of size, and of whether we are able to use public funds to build that kind of structure in Europe. Thank you very much. I would now like to open the floor for our participants. So far, we have not received any questions, so this is your moment. Please don't hesitate to ask your questions. We still have quite a bit of time. So I would suggest that we, both ministers and I, move away a bit from the purely European issues to transatlantic aspects. We've heard positive developments from Washington over the past few days. An election has happened. It may be a less happy occasion that your US colleague has lost his job overnight, but that is not our issue today. So my question is this, and it's a question to both ministers. How can, should, must we try and organize cooperation with the United States on cybersecurity in the future? Of course, there are several approaches in the context of NATO cooperation, but I believe that the cybersphere is an area that is also much about cooperation with private companies, with tech giants, and so on. So this is beyond the traditional area of responsibility of the transatlantic alliance. So I believe we need cooperation between the US and the EU on cybersecurity. There need to be debates about how we want to shape the future. So let me ask you a provocative question. This Charter of Trust that I've mentioned, so a voluntary union of private companies that make money with cybersecurity, amongst others, to offer security to their customers. Would it maybe make sense to discuss a transatlantic Charter of Digital Trust, to enter a dialogue on that with the United States? Or what do you think? What options are there to create a basis of trust in spite of industrial competition with the US in this area? Because our shared goal should be to really harness digital transformation in the area of defense. So maybe you could start, Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer, and your colleague afterwards. Thank you.
I think we all agree that the result of the US elections allows us to, well, bring the transatlantic relations to a more solid basis again. And I personally very much regret that I have lost my counterpart in the US, because Mark Esper really was a valued colleague who always stood up for the transatlantic relations. If we talk about having a momentum now, then that does not mean that the questions of the past, independent of the tone of voice in which they were raised, so burden sharing and other questions, it's not as if these issues have disappeared. Even with a president named Joe Biden, they will be pushed for in the same manner, maybe in a different tone of voice. Well, if we want to set this up on a new level now, you probably know the term of the New Deal. The foreign minister and I are using this term together. And the question is about whether to continue in our trade relations by putting punitive tariffs on each other, or wouldn't it be better to create an agreement without tariffs on our goods? And there's also the dimension of digitalization. The idea of having a quality seal in the sense of who shares the common values when it comes to privacy, when it comes to accountability, data security, etc. And elsewhere, with the like-minded states, we've been trying to create a real network. Also, this could also be done with the transatlantic relations, and this has a very practical dimension too. 5G, for example, we know that it's the infrastructure of the future. And we talk about the type of information that we want to share using this infrastructure, also sensitive data. There is, of course, a question about the companies that we use to expand the 5G infrastructure. And there is the important question whether the information can flow freely among partners in future. That's a question that we're addressing NATO as well. And if we have certain providers that are putting in tenders, and we know that they are being instructed by the national governments to pass on information to the intelligence services, then that is something that does not work together with our standards. And we need to set these standards within the NATO too, which includes the transatlantic link. So I see a high requirement for such agreements in the digital environment. Thank you very much, Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer. Before I pass over to Minister Bijleveld, I want to say that I fully agree when you say we should get away from levying tariffs, etc., in the transatlantic relations. I hope that the trade ministers of the EU are listening, because in recent days, actually since the days of the US elections, they have discussed new additional tariffs and made decisions on that. And from my point of view, that would be the wrong signal to our future transatlantic partner. But that's only an aside. Now, the response from Minister Bijleveld, and then we have 2 questions from the audience. Yes, I can only support what you said. I believe that the transatlantic relation has always been based on equality, and they benefit of a self-sufficient and strong, autonomous Europe. And that does not only apply to the military area, but also to the digital domain. In Europe, and I agree with Annegret here, we have certain initiatives like PESCO, where we have now solved the third state participation issue. Thank you very much for that, Annegret. That's a very important outcome, because when we talk about cooperation with the United States or with other NATO partners, then it's important that they can be involved in Europe. It's a question of connectivity and interoperability. And that is also important because we need it to ensure that we are in a position to conduct larger civil-military missions and operations under the roof of our own digital security and sovereignty, and can do this in a self-determined way. So I believe it's very important that we have achieved this now. I've already been at the Munich Security Conference 3 times. You mentioned the Charter of Trust that you established with the companies. And I am curious now, Mr. Ischinger, what the biggest problem was that you had. I think trust is the basis. Can you briefly tell me how it went when you agreed this Charter of Trust? Yes, I'm happy to do that. So the Charter of Trust, as I said, it's a voluntary agreement of a growing number of companies. One of the founders was Joe Kaeser, the CEO of Siemens, but Allianz, Daimler, Total, Deutsche Telekom, IBM, NXP, Allianz, Airbus, many other companies were part of it. And as part of this Charter of Trust, 10 principles were established. I can't tell you all of them right now, but some of them that the company committed to were topics that are important for the cooperation between states and companies, or among states. Let me just pick out 2 or 3 principles. One, the responsibility for cyber security has to be anchored at the highest level of the state, and everyone should have a chief information officer. That's the first point. Or point 5, innovation and co-creation. The common understanding of enterprises and political decision makers on cyber requirements need to be intensified to advance and adapt cyber measures. Relationships between public and private sector should be encouraged. And another point that I find important, because we're at a university here in Munich, it says cybersecurity should be part of the curriculum at universities and elsewhere. So special modules should be integrated on cybersecurity, not just for IT specialists, but also for the broader community of work. And I believe that applies particularly for employees in the military domain, whether it be at the ministry or as a soldier in the forces. All right, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to read 2 questions that have reached us from the audience, and I would be grateful if you could both respond briefly to these questions. First question to you both. What do you think about a possible integrative effect of the common perception of risks in cyberspace on the development towards a European defense union? Second question in the same direction. To achieve what Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer has suggested, do we not need a so-called digital strategy for that, both in Germany as well as in the European Union? So a comprehensive commonly drafted strategy. Let's begin with you, Minister Kramp-Karrenbauer, and then the Dutch Minister of Defense will have the last word. Thank you very much. Indeed, the threats from cyberspace are threats that we are experiencing all together and across borders. Just one example. As part of our NATO mission, one of our units is based in Lithuania, and we are experiencing cyber attacks there, fake news, faked images of German tanks vandalizing Jewish graveyards, so a massive disinformation campaign. And that does not only impact on the security of Lithuania, it also has an effect on us. And this is an example that shows these are common challenges, and we are currently working both within NATO and in the EU to address these challenges together. And to be honest, we're not lacking in strategies. We have a digital strategy of the German government, or we have a digital strategy at the European level. What we need now is that the different insights that we have and that we share, that they translate in concrete action, for example, as is done in CODE or Concordia. And that means for us at the Ministry of Defense, what we have identified as the right thing to do is something that we need to implement now, and that is very hard grassroots work. For example, when it comes to large procurements, it's not just about the big combat systems of the future. They are often very visible, but we need to put just as much energy into digital command and control capabilities. We can't talk about a digital battlefield if we can't even radio with each other with the different radio equipment that we have. So we need to have some catching up to do there. We haven't got a problem with insight or strategy. We have a problem with implementation, and that's what we need to work on. Thank you very much. And now the Dutch Minister of Defense will have the final word. Thank you very much. I don't have to add anything to the first question. The second question, yes, we also have a digital strategy in the Netherlands. I think in Europe we could do it better, though. We could strive for more interoperability. But in the Netherlands, we certainly have a digital strategy, and we're working on it concretely now. And that's why we also have this vision paper for 2035. So I believe there are concrete things to do. It is indeed about implementation, and we still have many steps to take here. And I think we could agree more at the European level on topics such as how do we approach 5G? How will we deal with large companies, large enterprises? I think we can do more here. And now I need to be leaving because we have a cabinet meeting on Corona. And that's why, unfortunately, I won't be there later at the round table. Thank you very much, Ank, and good discussions, and all the best for addressing the crisis. Thank you both. Thank you, Ank Bijleveld-Schouten. Thank you, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Thank you to both ministers. I think it was an exciting discussion. Now I'll hand back to the moderator.
Thank you. Thank you to our panel for an inspiring discussion, really. I'd also like to thank the audience for your active participation. We now have a break. And normally this is when you would be having lunch in the atrium and you would be walking around visiting our exhibitors' booths. Unfortunately, this year we cannot help you with lunch, but we do have virtual booths that you can visit through the conference portal, and we invite you to look at the different exhibitions that are available there. We reconvene here in the portal at 12:45, and we will continue our conference with the afternoon session from 12:45. Thank you all, and see you in the afternoon.